Lord. Help us to see you more clearly, to love you more dearly, to follow you more nearly, day by day. Amen. Y'all, I've been thinking a lot this week about 4 years ago. About 4 years ago, when I was looking around, I was in my final year at St. Paul's in Waco. I was just about to come to St. Stephen's, hadn't come to St. Stephen's yet, and we were in the midst of a rector's search at St. Paul's, and so I was a priest to this community that was really struggling. You know, it was 4 years ago, and if you recall, in 2016, there was a lot of tension. There was a lot of tension and a lot of division, and particularly between friends and coworkers and family members. And it was an election year that always has a role to play in that, as there was a hotly contested election happening, and people were they felt bitterly divided over the partisanship of it all. And I had so many people from the church coming to me and seeking pastoral counseling and saying, you know, around Thanksgiving time especially, so many of them coming and saying, Stephen, I'm not even sure I want to go and see my family at Thanksgiving this year. It's just too hard. It's from folks that, a lot of folks, going to Thanksgiving with your family is already not easy to begin with for some, right? But it felt particularly hard this year for them. And it felt to a lot of people like lines were being drawn in the sand. Like a line was being drawn in the sand, and I'm standing here and saying, if you dare to disagree with anything I say, then you're my enemy, and I'm your enemy. It's like Hatfields and McCoys. Now, that's how it felt 4 years ago. And so I'm so glad to see that here 4 years later, there's no division. There's no disagreement. We all get along perfectly fine with everyone, and there's no fighting between family or friends. No. Unfortunately, 4 years later, here we are. Now we have another election year. It's bringing in that same tension, the same fighting and deep divide between people who are called to love each other but just can't sometimes seem to find a way. And so people coming to me now, and they're seeking counseling and seeking care of how can we do something about this broken and divided world where it seems like we just disagree and fight and draw that line in the sand, and we're Hatfields and McCoys. And I think to myself, well, surely there's got to be a better role model for us. Surely there's got to be a better role model for our people than the Hatfields and the McCoys. I think we can find somebody better, right? So I thought to myself, well, what about the disciples? Jesus' disciples. Now, there's role models to follow, right? The disciples of Jesus, those are 12 people that they got along great with each other. They agreed about everything, didn't they? They all loved Jesus, they loved the gospel, and they were in complete agreement in every way, big and small, right? No. If you look at the story of the 12 disciples, you actually see a story of 12 people who were very different from each other and disagreed about some really fundamental things. I want us to stop and take a look for just a little while here at who some of the people Jesus called as his disciples were. Look at our gospel. The first two people Jesus called were Andrew and Peter, Simon Peter. Andrew was the first. He was a fisherman. Andrew was the first, and he was a follower of John the Baptist. And he probably met Jesus through John the Baptist. And Andrew, he ran right to his brother, Simon Peter, and said, Simon, you got to check this guy Jesus out. I think he's the real deal. And so these two fishermen, these two brothers, became Jesus' disciples. Now, you may be thinking, brothers, this is great. Brothers, how could you have disagreement between brothers? I know surely each and every one of you has perfect relationships with your family members, and there's no disagreement between siblings at all, right? No, the reality is that sometimes some of our hardest divides that we face are among our family. Family is messy. Family is messy with people that you disagree with deeply, and some of you may know exactly what I'm talking about. Maybe you have a sibling that, you love them, but boy, you just can't seem to get along. Or maybe even harder, maybe there's cutoff or estrangement, as some of us have in our families, where we don't even feel like they love us or we love them. Family is messy. Yet rather than avoiding that conflict, Jesus brought it in to his disciples. The next two disciples Jesus gathered were James and John, a couple of other fishermen on the same shore. And he reached out to the sons of Zebedee, James and John, said, "You two fishermen, follow me too." And so now Jesus had all these fishermen. He had Andrew and Peter, and he had James and John, and we could think to ourselves, well, great, this is agreement. Maybe Jesus could have this whole fisherman disciples thing, right? They get along. But think about this. If James and John were fishermen on that same shore as Andrew and Peter, that actually meant they were rivals. They were business competitors. They were fishing in the same waters, which meant every fish that Andrew and Peter got was a fish that James and John couldn't have. And so, as you all know, sometimes business is messy. And so just like family is messy, business is messy. And yet, rather than avoid that conflict, Jesus brought it in to his disciples. It's worth noting too that it seems like the Zebedee family was probably kind of well off. We see that Zebedee, the father of James and John, he had a lot of fishermen working for him, not just his sons. He had a whole crew, which seems to indicate he had a going concern, as they say. He was probably doing really well there, and you have poor Andrew and Simon over there with their little boat by themselves fishing. And so there's status difference. There's a difference in their status. And as we all know, status is messy, high and low. And yet, rather than looking at that and seeing it as conflict to avoid, Jesus took, just like family is messy, just like business is messy, status is messy, but Jesus welcomed it into his disciples. We see Philip, a man for whom it seemed like his faith came easily to him. He was a great evangelist who had no trouble going out and proclaiming the word. And then we see Thomas, who struggled and doubted, wasn't quite as sure. And we see that there are great differences in people because of their differences in how they handle their faith. And Thomas could be judging Philip because he says he's not a realist. He's more skeptical than that. Philip could be judging Thomas and saying, well, you're doubting Thomas. There's division between them. Faith, trust, and hope, those things get messy, especially when we disagree. But rather than avoid it, Jesus welcomed it into his disciples. Matthew, the tax collector. Matthew, the tax collector, was a government agent. He was somebody for whom his job was to support the authorities and the government by going and collecting the taxes. Jesus paired him up with Simon the Zealot, Simon the Cananean, who was anti-establishment, who was a radical anti-government figure. He challenged authority wherever he could. And so you've got this pro-government employee and this anti-government zealot. And as we all know, politics is messy. But rather than avoid it, just like with family and with business and with faith and with status, Jesus took political conflict and brought it into his disciples. We see Peter, who betrayed Jesus and sought forgiveness. We see Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus and didn't seek forgiveness from him. Yes, Jesus, even when it comes to welcoming conflict into his disciples, Jesus even welcomed Judas, knowing he would betray him, knowing he would lead to his death. And Jesus welcomed him into the disciples too. Far from it being an example of people who love each other because they get along, if you take an honest look at the disciples, you see a group of people who were incredibly different from each other, who disagreed about some fundamentally important issues where they did not see eye to eye. And yet, how did they do it? How did they do it? How were they not the Hatfields and the McCoys? How did those 12 men work together and not be divisive? Well, I think the key to that is that Jesus rooted them all in love. He didn't try to take their differences away from them. So I don't think our journey should be one of trying to figure out how we can get along by eliminating our differences. It's not going to happen. We are always going to have differences between when it comes to family and business and politics and, and faith and sports and all these things. We're going to disagree. Yet, just like Jesus' disciples, we could be rooted in love. Jesus built a foundation for them all to say, you're going to disagree with each other, but our foundation is going to be loving God and loving each other. We don't wait to agree with our neighbor before we love them. We love them even in disagreement. I can only imagine what some of those conversations must have been like, the 12 of them gathered in a space together. But it was probably a lot messier than we think of in the Bible. But they were a success, and they changed the world, and they built the church because they were rooted in love. We're living in a time right now where we have to find a path for us. We people who just live in a messy world where we don't agree about things, and we won't agree about things. But we need to be rooted in that same kind of love, to look to somebody that we disagree with and start from the place of seeing somebody worthy of love. There's a lot of calls right now in the midst of our church for something kind of like the gathering of truth and reconciliation from South Africa at the end of apartheid. That was a time where people didn't avoid each other because they disagreed. But you know what they did was they gathered with people that they deeply disagreed with. They heard each other. They listened to each other's stories. They gave the person that they disagreed with the respect and the love to hear them, to listen to them, to seek forgiveness for wrongs that had been committed, and to look for a path forward together, even in the midst of brokenness. So I, for one, am certainly excited about that opportunity. I hope you are too. I want to invite you with me to try to be people who don't look at a world where how can we try to get people to agree, but to look at a world where we say, how in the midst of our disagreement can we start from a foundation of saying we're going to build everything on love and go from there. If we do that, we put aside the old role models of the Hatfields and the McCoys, and we welcome and we wear the mantle of the role models of the 12 different, really different, yet loving disciples. Amen.